The sun was setting over the quiet streets of Millbrook when a well-dressed black man stepped off the bus, carrying just a simple leather briefcase. He had purposely chosen to arrive without fanfare, wearing casual clothes, a comfortable navy sweater, and dark jeans that helped him blend in with the evening crowd. This was Officer James Wilson, though no one in town knew him by that title yet. As he walked down Main Street, taking in the sights of what would soon be his new jurisdiction, he couldn't help but notice how the small-town charm masked deeper tensions. Store owners were hurriedly closing up shop, some casting nervous glances at groups of young people hanging out near the corner store. A patrol car cruised by slowly, and James observed how the teenagers instantly scattered, despite not doing anything wrong. He'd done his homework before accepting the position as police chief. Millbrook had a history of strained relationships between law enforcement and its residents, especially in communities of color. The town's statistics told a story of disproportionate stops and arrests, but numbers could never capture the full picture. That's why he was here now, walking these streets as just another visitor. James stopped at a local diner, settling into a corner booth where he could watch both the street and the interactions inside. The waitress was kind, though she seemed surprised when he ordered just coffee. Through the window, he noticed how people's body language changed whenever a police car drove by. The subtle stiffening of shoulders, parents calling their children closer, elderly folks hurrying their steps. As the evening wore on, he pulled out his small notebook, jotting down observations. The current police force had fallen into predictable patterns. The same patrol routes, the same areas where they lingered, the same people they seemed to watch with unnecessary intensity. But James also noticed something else. Moments of genuine community. A young officer helped an elderly man with his groceries. A patrol car stopped to help change a flat tire. These were the seeds of something better, waiting for the right conditions to grow. He'd chosen this undercover approach carefully. Too often, new chiefs arrived with sirens blaring and badges flashing, making grand promises at press conferences before they even learned the community's real needs. James believed in seeing things as they were, not as people pretended them to be when authority was watching. His years in law enforcement had taught him that real change starts with understanding, not announcements. The diner was nearly empty now. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows, and James watched a group of officers congregating near their patrol cars in front of the station. Their laughter carried across the quiet street, but he noticed how they fell silent when certain residents walked by. It was these small moments, these subtle interactions, that told the real story of a police department's relationship with its community. As he paid his bill, leaving a generous tip that made the tired waitress smile, James thought about the challenge ahead. Tomorrow, he would begin his official observations, still anonymous, still just another face in the crowd. He knew from experience that the next few days would be crucial. Someone had once told him that you never get a second chance at a first impression. But sometimes, the most powerful first impression is the one you make when people don't know they're being impressed. Walking back to his hotel, James felt the weight of his mission, but also its possibility. In his briefcase were the papers announcing his appointment as chief, but for now, they would stay there, waiting for the right moment. The real work of change was already beginning, with every step he took on these streets, with every observation he made, with every interaction he witnessed. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, he was just another set of eyes, watching, learning, and planning for the changes to come. The morning brought a different energy to Millbrook streets. James walked through the neighborhood with his phone out, appearing to be just another visitor taking in the sights. What he was really doing was documenting a troubling scene unfolding across the street, where two officers had surrounded a group of teenagers outside the local basketball court. The kids had been doing nothing wrong, just shooting hoops before school. But Officers Parker and Reynolds, who James had researched in the department files, were known for what they called preventative enforcement. Right now, they were making these young people empty their backpacks onto the sidewalk, checking for contraband that James could already tell wasn't there. His blood pressure rose as he watched, but years of training kept his expression neutral. He'd seen this scene play out countless times in his 20 years of law enforcement. The casual cruelty disguised as procedure, the humiliation masked as protocol. One of the teenagers, probably no more than 15, was close to tears as his school books and basketball gear were scattered across the concrete. James moved closer, pretending to check his phone while actually recording the incident. That's when Officer Parker noticed him. The officer's demeanor changed instantly, that familiar switch from harassment to harassment with a badge that James had witnessed too many times before. "Hey you," Parker called out, his hand already resting on his belt. "What do you think you're doing?" James kept his voice steady, professional. "Just observing, officer. Public street, public sidewalk." He knew his rights, but he also knew that knowledge wasn't always enough protection. Reynolds joined his partner, leaving the teenagers to scramble away. A small mercy, at least. "Let's see some ID," he demanded, not asked. The word please wasn't in either officer's vocabulary, apparently. James reached slowly for his wallet, maintaining eye contact. "I'm happy to show you my ID, officers. But I'd like to know what violation you suspect me of committing." He kept his tone respectful but firm, the same tone he taught younger officers to use during his years as an instructor. That seemed to anger them more. Parker stepped closer, invading James's personal space. "You're interfering with police business. That's what you're doing wrong." "Standing on a public sidewalk isn't interference," James replied calmly. "And those young people weren't doing anything wrong either." "Oh, we got ourselves an expert here," Reynolds sneered, exchanging glances with his partner. "Someone who thinks he knows police work better than actual police." The irony of their words might have been funny in another situation. But there was nothing humorous about what happened next. As James reached for his phone to stop the recording, Parker grabbed his arm. The move was swift, practiced, the kind of motion that wouldn't look like much on a body camera review, but contained just enough force to hurt. "That phone's evidence now," Parker declared, snatching it from James's hand. Reynolds was already moving behind him, twisting his other arm back. James could have resisted. He could have announced who he was right then. But he needed to see this through. Needed to experience firsthand what citizens in his new jurisdiction faced. So he stayed calm, even as the handcuffs bit into his wrists, even as the officers roughly patted him down. "Nothing on him," Reynolds announced, sounding almost disappointed. "Just a wallet and a hotel key." "Still got his phone, though," Parker added with satisfaction. "Bet he'll think twice about playing amateur photographer now." James watched his phone disappear into Parker's pocket, knowing it contained not just the video from today, but all his notes and observations from yesterday. Evidence indeed, just not the kind the officers thought it was. As they led him away from the basketball court, James noticed faces in windows, people on porches quickly turning away. This was why he'd come in quietly, why he'd chosen to see the department's true colors before taking command. Sometimes the best way to fix a broken system was to experience its failures firsthand. The metal pole was cold against James's back as officers Parker and Reynolds secured the zip ties around his wrists. They'd chosen the busiest corner in town, right in front of the local coffee shop where morning customers were starting to gather. Some looked away in embarrassment, while others couldn't help but stare at the scene unfolding before them. "Let's see how smart you feel now," Parker said, tightening the restraints a bit more than necessary. The plastic dug into James's skin, but he kept his face neutral, watching how the officers performed for their impromptu audience. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was a message to everyone watching. "You know this is wrong," James said quietly, making sure nearby people could hear. "This isn't what the badge stands for." His words seemed to strike a nerve with Reynolds, who stepped closer, his face reddening. "You don't tell us what the badge stands for," Reynolds snapped. "You're just another troublemaker who needs to learn some respect." A small crowd had gathered now, keeping their distance but unable to look away. James noticed a young woman discreetly recording with her phone from the coffee shop window. Good. The more documentation, the better. An elderly man stepped forward, leaning on his cane. "Officers, surely this isn't necessary," the man said, his voice shaking slightly. "He doesn't look like he's causing any trouble." "Step back, sir," Parker commanded, his hand resting meaningfully on his belt. "This is police business." The old man retreated, but James saw the shame and anger in his eyes. More phones were out now, recording. The officers noticed too, but instead of making them reconsider their actions, it seemed to make them more determined to put on a show. "Maybe a few hours in the sun will teach you about respecting law enforcement," Reynolds said, loud enough for everyone to hear. He turned to the gathering crowd. "Let this be a lesson. This is what happens when you interfere with police work." The morning sun was getting stronger, and James could feel sweat starting to roll down his back. But it wasn't the heat that bothered him. It was watching his future officers demonstrate exactly why he'd been brought in to reform this department. Each passing minute confirmed everything he'd read in the reports about systemic issues in Millbrook's police force. A mother hurried past with 2 young children, trying to shield their eyes from the scene. One child still turned to look, his innocent face confused and frightened. James's heart ached. This was exactly the kind of trauma that created lifelong fear and distrust of law enforcement. "Don't you have real work to do?" a voice called from the crowd, "like solving actual crimes? Anyone else want to join him?" Parker shouted back, causing the crowd to shuffle backwards. But they didn't leave. They stood their ground, phones recording, witnesses to what happened when power went unchecked. James noticed a teenager on a bike speeding away from the scene. He recognized him as one of the boys from the basketball court earlier. Something told him that kid wasn't just running away. He was running to get help. The thought almost made him smile, despite the situation. The zip ties were really starting to hurt now, and James's shoulders ached from the awkward position. But he remained silent, watching, observing. He saw how Parker strutted back and forth, playing to the crowd. How Reynolds kept glancing around nervously, maybe starting to realize they'd gone too far. How the growing number of witnesses made them both increasingly agitated. "Not so talkative now, are you?" Parker taunted, but James could hear a slight tremor in his voice. The officer was starting to realize that this situation might have consequences he hadn't considered. A police cruiser turned the corner, and for a moment, James thought another officer might put a stop to this. Instead, it drove slowly past, the officer inside deliberately looking straight ahead. Another note for James's mental file: the department's culture of silence ran deep. Time seemed to slow down under the morning sun as more people gathered, their phones recording, their faces showing a mix of outrage and helplessness. But James knew this moment wouldn't last forever. Soon, very soon, everything would change. He just had to wait for the right moment, and that moment was coming faster than Officers Parker and Reynolds could possibly imagine. The black SUV pulled up to the curb with quiet authority, its tires crunching on the sun-baked asphalt. The crowd parted as the town mayor stepped out, her face a mixture of horror and disbelief. Behind her, the teenager from the basketball court hopped off his bike, out of breath but wearing a look of satisfaction. "What in God's name is going on here?" The mayor's voice cut through the morning air like a knife. The spectators fell silent, phones still recording as she strode toward the pole where James stood restrained. Officers Parker and Reynolds suddenly stood straighter, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of actual authority. "Ma'am," Parker started, "we were just dealing with—" "Release him. Now." The mayor's voice was quiet, but carried the weight of a thunderclap. When the officers hesitated, she stepped closer. "I said release him. Immediately." Reynolds fumbled with a pair of scissors from his belt, his hands shaking slightly as he cut the zip ties. As James rolled his shoulders to restore circulation, the mayor turned to the gathered crowd. I apologize that you all had to witness this today, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent street. Then she turned back to the officers, who were trying their best to look anywhere but at James. Officers, I believe you have something that belongs to him. Parker pulled James's phone from his pocket, almost dropping it in his haste. The screen was still recording, had been recording this whole time. The officer's face went pale as this realization hit him. Now, the mayor said, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth, I'd like to introduce you to someone. She gestured to James, who was now standing tall, despite the lingering discomfort in his shoulders. This is your new police chief. The silence that followed was deafening. A coffee cup dropped somewhere in the crowd, its contents splashing across the sidewalk. Parker's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, while Reynolds seemed to have forgotten how to breathe entirely. That's right, James said, his voice carrying easily over the murmuring crowd. I wanted to see this department as it really is, not as it pretends to be when the brass is watching. He straightened his shirt, now wrinkled from his time against the pole. I'd say this morning has been very educational. The teenager who'd fetched the mayor couldn't contain his grin. Several people in the crowd had hands over their mouths, while others were quickly sharing what they'd just heard with those around them. The news was spreading through the gathered crowd like wildfire. Chief, Parker stammered, Sir, we weren't. Save it, James said, not unkindly. We'll discuss this in detail back at the station. For now, I suggest you both return to your patrol car and wait there. The officers practically tripped over themselves retreating to their vehicle. As they left, James turned to address the crowd, his voice firm but reassuring. What you witnessed today wasn't just about me, he said. It was about every person who's ever been humiliated or mistreated by those sworn to protect them. But I want you all to know, changes are coming to this department. He paused, making eye contact with several onlookers, including the elderly man who tried to intervene earlier. I'm not here to punish or shame. I'm here to fix what's broken, and I'm counting on this community to help me do that. The mayor touched his arm gently. Your office is ready whenever you're prepared to start, Chief. James nodded, looking at his phone and the damning video it contained. I think I'll start right now. We've got a lot of work to do. As he walked toward the police station, people stepped forward to shake his hand or pat his shoulder. The teenager who'd brought the mayor gave him a quick thumbs up before pedaling away on his bike. Even the morning sun seemed brighter somehow, as if it too approved of the changes about to come to Millbrook. Inside the patrol car, Officers Parker and Reynolds sat in stunned silence, watching their new chief walk away, knowing that their world was about to change forever. And judging by the look on James's face, that change was starting today. The police station's main meeting room had never been so quiet. Every chair was filled, every officer present, as James walked to the front in his full chief's uniform. The brass name tag caught the fluorescent light, making several officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Officers Parker and Reynolds sat in the back, looking like they wished the floor would swallow them whole. Good morning, James began, his voice calm but firm. I think some introductions are in order. He picked up a remote and clicked it. The screen behind him came to life, showing the morning's events from multiple angles. His phone footage mixed with videos from community members who'd already sent their recordings to the mayor's office. A collective intake of breath filled the room as the officers watched their colleagues zip-tie their new chief to a pole. Some looked down at their hands, others glanced nervously at their neighbors. In the back, Parker seemed to be shrinking into his chair. Now, I could start this meeting by firing the officers involved, James said, pausing the video. I could suspend half this department for the things I've witnessed in just 2 days. He looked around the room, meeting eyes that quickly darted away. But that's not why I'm here. He walked slowly between the rows of chairs. I'm here because this department can be better. Must be better. The people out there. He gestured toward the window, toward the town beyond, deserve better. Taking out his phone, James played the audio from earlier that morning. Officers making casual remarks about teaching lessons and showing who's in charge filled the room. Several officers winced at the words. This isn't about two officers who made a bad choice, James continued. This is about a culture that made them think that choice was acceptable. He stopped walking and turned to face the room. How many of you saw what was happening this morning and drove past? How many looked the other way when your colleagues abused their power? The silence was deafening. One young officer in the front row raised her hand slightly. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We wanted to say something, but—" She trailed off, but her unfinished sentence hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "But you were afraid," James finished for her. "Afraid of being labeled a troublemaker. Afraid of being ostracized. Afraid of becoming a target yourself." He nodded understanding. "That ends today." Moving back to the front of the room, James opened a folder on the podium. "Starting tomorrow, we begin mandatory retraining. Not just about bias and procedure, but about courage. The courage to stand up when you see something wrong, even if, especially if, the person doing wrong is wearing the same uniform you are." He clicked to the next slide, showing statistics about community trust in law enforcement. The numbers were dismal. This is how our community sees us. Not as protectors, but as threats. That changes now. Parker raised his hand, surprising everyone. His voice was rough with emotion. "Chief, about this morning." "Officer Parker," James cut him off, "you and Officer Reynolds will be the first to go through the new training program. You'll also be spending the next month doing community service, not in uniform, but as citizens. The basketball court needs repainting, and those kids you harassed this morning will be supervising your work." A few nervous chuckles broke out, quickly silenced by James' stern look. "This isn't the joke. This is about rebuilding trust, one action at a time." He clicked to the final slide, showing a simple quote, "To protect and serve." "These words mean something," James said softly. "They're not just a slogan on our cars. They're a promise we make to our community every time we put on this uniform." He touched his badge. "Starting today, we're going to live up to that promise." Looking around the room one last time, James saw something new in some of the faces, not just fear or shame, but hope. Change wouldn't come easily, but it would come. The young officer who'd spoken up was sitting straighter now, pride replacing fear in her posture. "Dismissed," James said. "Except for Officers Parker and Reynolds. You two, my office. Now." As the room emptied, he gathered his materials, knowing that the real work was just beginning. But for the first time in years, it felt like real change was possible in Millbrook. The changes in Millbrook's police department started small, but spread quickly, like ripples in a pond. Each morning, James arrived early to find more officers already there, eager to be part of the transformation. The once empty community meeting room now buzzed with activity as officers participated in new training sessions. Today, he watched through his office window as Officer Parker, the same officer who'd zip-tied him to a pole just weeks ago, sat with a group of local teenagers, learning about their experiences with law enforcement. The kids from the basketball court were there too, no longer afraid, but engaged in real conversation. "The thing is," one of the teens was saying, "we never knew which officer we get, the one who'd help us or the one who'd hassle us just for existing." Parker nodded, writing notes, his face showing genuine understanding for perhaps the first time. In another corner, Officer Reynolds was working with the department's new community advisory board. The same elderly man who tried to intervene during the pole incident was there, now helping design new patrol guidelines. The change in Reynolds was remarkable. Gone was the aggressive stance, replaced by an attentive listener. The young female officer who'd spoken up in that first meeting was leading her own training session now. "We're not just enforcing laws," she explained to a group of new recruits. We're building trust, one interaction at a time. James smiled, remembering how she'd come to his office the day after the meeting, full of ideas for improvement. But not everyone embraced the changes. A small group of veteran officers huddled in the break room, grumbling about soft policing and political correctness. James knew they'd posted anonymous complaints, claiming he was destroying department morale. He'd expected this resistance. Change never came without pushback. Walking through the station, he passed the newly installed suggestion box, already filling with notes from both officers and community members. Next to it hung a board covered with photos. Officers at community events, playing basketball with local kids, helping elderly residents with groceries. Real moments, not stage photo ops. "Chief," called a voice. It was Parker, looking nervous but determined. "Could you look at something?" He held up a proposal for a new youth outreach program, developed with input from the teenagers he'd been working with. They had some really good ideas about how we could do better. James took the proposal, noting how Parker's hands were steady now when they talked. No more defensive posturing or nervous fidgeting. "Tell me about it," he said, and watched as his once hostile officer launched into an enthusiastic explanation of basketball tournaments and mentoring programs. Later that afternoon, James joined a patrol briefing. The atmosphere had changed here too. Officers discussed problem areas in terms of helping people, not just making arrests. When one officer mentioned a homeless encampment, the conversation focused on connecting people with resources rather than simply clearing them out. "Remember," the shift supervisor said, "we're guardians, not warriors." It was one of James's favorite phrases, and hearing it repeated by others showed how the message was spreading. A call came in. Teenagers gathered at the mall. 6 weeks ago, that would have meant aggressive dispersal and possibly arrests. Today, he listened as the responding officers talked about checking on the kids' welfare and ensuring they had safe spaces to hang out. The day ended with a community feedback session. The room was packed, not with angry protesters, but with engaged citizens working alongside officers to solve neighborhood problems. Even some of the resistant officers had started attending, drawn in by the positive energy and real results they were seeing. As James gathered his things to leave, he noticed something new on his desk. A thank you card from a local family. Inside were photos of their children playing safely in the park, police officers visible in the background, not as intimidating figures, but as trusted protectors. Walking to his car, he passed Officer Reynolds teaching the young rookie how to approach community members with respect. "Remember," Reynolds was saying, "everyone we meet is somebody's family member. Treat them that way." James couldn't help but smile. The same officer who'd helped humiliate him weeks ago was now teaching others about dignity and respect. The sun was setting over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the station's parking lot. But unlike before, these shadows didn't hide tensions and fear. Instead, they marked the end of another day of positive change, another step toward the kind of police department this community deserved. Not everyone was happy with the winds of change sweeping through Millbrook's police department. The resistance started with whispers in corners and quickly grew louder. One morning, James arrived at his office to find an unsigned note on his desk. "Go back where you came from." He quietly folded it and added it to a growing file. A group of 5 veteran officers had taken to gathering at Murphy's bar after their shifts, their complaints getting louder with each passing drink. "He's turning us into social workers," one would grumble. "This isn't what real police work looks like," another would add. They'd been on the force for 20 years each, set in their ways like old concrete. The tension came to a head during a routine morning briefing. Officer Wilson, one of the most vocal critics, stood up in the middle of James' presentation about community engagement. "With all due respect, Chief," he said, though his tone carried anything but respect, "while we're out here playing basketball and holding hands, real criminals are laughing at us. Our arrest numbers are down 30%. James set down his papers calmly. Our violent crime rate is down 20%. Citizen complaints have dropped by half. Emergency response times have improved. Would you like to explain how that's a failure, Officer Wilson? The room fell silent. Even Wilson's usual supporters looked uncomfortable. From the back of the room, Officer Parker, once James's staunchest opponent, cleared his throat. "Chief's right," Parker said, surprising everyone. "Last week, I helped that kid Tommy get into a youth program instead of arresting him for shoplifting. Yesterday, his mom stopped me on patrol. Turns out he's doing better in school now. That matters more than arrest numbers." Wilson's face reddened. "You've gone soft, Parker. All of you have." He looked around the room, seeking support, but found fewer allies than before. "This isn't what we signed up for." "No," James replied quietly. "You signed up to serve and protect. Sometimes that means protecting people from their worst moments, not just punishing them for them." Later that day, James found another note in his mailbox, this one threatening to call the state police board with complaints about his leadership. He added it to his file, next to the photos he'd been collecting of successful community programs and improved statistics. Officer Reynolds, who'd been quiet during the morning's confrontation, knocked on his door. "Chief, got a minute?" His face was troubled. "Some of the old guard, they're planning something. Trying to get the union to file a formal complaint, saying you're creating a hostile work environment." James nodded. He'd expected this. "And what do you think, Reynolds?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. I think about that day you let us tie you to that pole. How you could fired us on the spot. Instead, you showed us a better way." He straightened up. "They're wrong, Chief, and they don't speak for all of us." That evening, as James was leaving the station, he found a small crowd gathered in the parking lot. His heart sank, expecting the worst. But as he got closer, he realized they weren't protesters. They were community members holding signs of support. "Thank you, Chief," read one. "Real change, real progress," said another. The teenager who'd brought the mayor that fateful morning was there too, now wearing a police explorer uniform. "We heard some officers were giving you trouble," he said. "Thought you should know we've got your back." James looked at the gathering. Parents whose kids now played freely in parks that were once drug corners, elderly residents who no longer feared walking at night, even some former critics who'd seen the positive changes firsthand. This was what real community policing looked like. His phone buzzed with a message from the mayor. State Police Review Board just released their quarterly numbers. "Millbrook's improvement rates are the highest in the state. Keep going." As the sun set behind the station, James watched Officer Wilson and his supporters leave for their usual bar visit. They were fewer in number now, their grumbling less confident. Change was winning, not through force or fear, but through results that even the strongest critics couldn't ignore forever. 6 months had passed since that morning at the poll, and Millbrook was a different place. The police station, once a fortress of cold authority, now buzzed with community activity. The front desk, previously secured behind thick glass, had been replaced with an open welcome area where officers and citizens could talk face to face. Officer Parker, once the department's most notorious hardliner, was leading a morning briefing. "Remember, folks, the community fair is this weekend. We'll be there to participate, not just provide security." He smiled at the new recruits. "And yes, I'm still signed up for the dome tank." The transformation wasn't just in the building or procedures. It showed in the small moments. Like when Officer Reynolds stopped his patrol car to help kids fix their bikes, or when the night shift brought coffee to homeless individuals instead of moving them along. These weren't policy requirements. They were choices officers were making on their own. Even the old guard was starting to come around. Officer Wilson, who'd been one of the loudest critics, had a breakthrough moment when he encountered a teenager spray painting a wall. Instead of making an arrest, he talked to the kid and discovered real artistic talent. Now that same wall was becoming a community mural project, with Wilson helping to coordinate between young artists and local businesses. "You know what the weird part is, Chief?" Wilson said one morning, shaking his head. "I sleep better now. Used to go home angry every night, seeing the worst in everyone. Now I see possibilities instead of problems." The community had noticed the change too. Local shops that once hurried to lock up when patrol cars drove by now offered free coffee to officers who walked their beats. The basketball court, freshly painted thanks to Parker and Reynolds' community service, had become a regular spot for police youth pickup games. Crime rates continued to fall, but more importantly, trust was rising. People were calling the police before small problems became big ones. Tips started flowing in about serious crimes because people finally believed the police were there to help, not harm. James walked through the station, remembering how tense it had been just months ago. Now he passed training rooms where officers practiced de-escalation techniques with community volunteers. The old interrogation room had been converted into a meditation space where officers could decompress after difficult calls. The department's newest recruit was the teenage girl who'd recorded the pole incident on her phone. "I used to want to be a lawyer to fight against police brutality," she told James during her interview. "Now I want to be part of making sure it never happens in the first place." The biggest surprise came from Parker. He'd asked to start a mentorship program for troubled youth, using his own experience of change as a teaching tool. "I was wrong for so long," he admitted during the program's first session. "But being wrong doesn't mean you can't make things right." Local businesses reported increased foot traffic as people felt safer walking the streets at night. The park that used to empty at sunset now hosted evening community events, with officers joining in rather than just watching from their cars. One day, James found an envelope on his desk. Inside was a photo from that morning at the pole, along with a new picture of the same spot. Where there had been fear and tension, there was now a community gathering space with benches and flowers. The note attached read, "Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best changes. Your department." The resistance hadn't completely disappeared. Change never comes without its holdouts. But even the skeptics couldn't argue with the results. Other departments started sending observers to learn from Millbrook's transformation. The local news, which once ran weekly stories about police misconduct, now covered community police partnerships and successful intervention programs. As the sun set over Millbrook that evening, James watched from his office as Officer Parker taught a group of kids proper basketball technique in the station parking lot. Officer Reynolds was there too, grilling hot dogs for a community dinner. Even Officer Wilson had shown up, helping to set up tables. The pole was still there, now wrapped in colorful community artwork. It stood as a reminder not of humiliation, but of transformation, proof that even the darkest moments could lead to the brightest changes. 1 year after the pole incident, Millbrook's police station was hosting something unprecedented: a national conference on community policing. Police chiefs and officers from across the country filled the community room, eager to learn how a small-town department had achieved what many thought impossible. James stood at the podium, but he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Officer Parker, no longer the angry cop who'd once zip-tied his chief to a pole, but a changed man ready to share their story. "A year ago," James began, "I was tied to a pole right outside this building." A murmur went through the crowd. "Today, that same spot is where we hold our weekly community gatherings. The officer who put me there," he gestured to Parker, "is now leading our youth outreach program." Parker stepped forward, his hands steady on the podium. "I was the problem," he said simply. "I thought being tough meant being cruel. I thought respect came from fear." He paused, looking at the gathered officers. "I was wrong." In the audience, faces showed everything from skepticism to hope. A police chief from a large city raised his hand. "Your crime rates are down, but what about officer morale? Surely this soft approach has affected department spirits." Officer Reynolds, sitting in the front row, stood up. "May I answer that, Chief?" At James's nod, he turned to face the crowd. "Last year, I was taking blood pressure medication and sleeping pills. I was angry all the time. Now," he smiled, "I coach Little League. I sleep at night. My kids aren't afraid to tell people their dad's a cop anymore." The day unfolded with session after session. Officers who'd once been part of the problem now led workshops on de-escalation and community engagement. The teenager who'd brought the mayor that fateful morning, now a cadet in the police academy, shared his perspective on bridging the gap between youth and law enforcement. During the lunch break, visitors walked around the transformed station. They saw the meditation room, the community welcome center, the wall of success stories. But what caught most people's attention was a simple frame hanging in the main hallway. The zip ties from that morning, mounted alongside the department's new motto, "Change starts with us." The afternoon session opened with a surprise. The elderly man who tried to intervene during the pole incident walked to the podium, supported by Officer Wilson, once the department's biggest critic, now one of its strongest advocates for change. "I've lived in this town for 70 years, the old man said. "Never thought I'd see the day when I'd be proud to walk into a police station. Never thought I'd see officers playing basketball with my grandkids. Never thought I'd see change like this." As the conference drew to a close, James shared their latest initiative, a program where officers who'd been through Millbrook's transformation would help other departments start their own journey of change. Parker and Reynolds had already signed up to be mentors. The hardest part, James concluded, isn't making the changes. It's admitting they're needed. Every department has its pole moment, that point where you either change or lose your soul. The question is, what do you do when that moment comes? After the formal sessions ended, visitors lingered, asking questions, taking notes. In the parking lot, the same spot where angry officers once gathered to complain now hosted an impromptu cookout. Officers from different departments shared stories and hopes for their own communities. A young officer from another state approached James quietly. "My department. It's like yours was. Things happen that shouldn't. But after today," she straightened her shoulders, "after today, I know change is possible." As the sun set on Millbrook one last time in our story, the pole stood wrapped in fresh flowers, not as a symbol of shame, but as a monument to transformation. Officers and community members gathered around it, sharing stories and laughter. James watched from the steps, remembering that morning a year ago. Parker joined him, both men thinking about how far they'd come. "You know, Chief," Parker said softly, "sometimes the best changes start with the worst mistakes." The evening ended with a community dinner right there in the street, officers and citizens sharing tables, the barriers between them long gone. Above them, the station's new sign glowed softly. Millbrook Police Department. Guardians of Community, Agents of Change. The story of the pole would be told many times in the years to come, not as a tale of humiliation, but as proof that even the darkest moments could lead to the brightest futures, if people were brave enough to change.